Josep Castanyer Alonso is a Spanish cellist who plays with the Royal Stockholm Philharmonic Orchestra. However, alongside the cello, which is his main instrument, he also plays the piano. And from what I can tell, he's pretty good at that as well. But how good is he? Well, today I'm going to react to a video that he made playing I'm a Barbie Girl in the style of 6 different composers. So let's get into it. Yeah, so this is kind of reminding me of another pianist that I reacted to called Na Sol, because she also played a piece written in the style of lots of different composers. The interesting thing about playing something in the style of a certain composer is that it makes you understand exactly what that specific composer does in order to make it sound that way. For example, Mozart is from the classical period of classical music, which was around the mid-1700s. And that specific period of music has a very particular sound to the style of music. And that is because for most composers around that time, they used to play things in 4-bar phrases. They used to use cadences a lot. They used a lot of call and response, so they'd have one phrase and end that phrase with a specific type of cadence, and then they'd have another phrase and end it with a different type of cadence. And in music, a cadence is just the chords that we use at the end of phrases in order to punctuate the music. So for example, if I'm in the key of C major and using a C major scale, if I use chord 5, so the chord that's based on note 5, and then chord 1, so the chord that's based on note 1, this is called a perfect cadence, and this sounds like a full stop or a period. So if I play a phrase and end it with chord 5 and then 1, then it sounds complete and like that is a complete sentence. Whereas if I use chord 1 to 5, then that sounds like a comma because it feels like there needs to be a responding phrase afterwards. Chord 1, chord 5. That is an imperfect cadence, and that feels like there needs to be another responding phrase after it with a perfect cadence on the end. So in the classical period, you'll get this a lot, where you get one 4-bar phrase that ends in an imperfect cadence with a responding 4-bar phrase that ends in a perfect cadence, like this. If you notice these kind of patterns that certain periods of music and certain specific composers do, then not only does it help be able to play in that specific style, but it also means that you understand the pieces that you're playing much, much better. It's also interesting because you can hear influence from very specific pieces that Mozart wrote. But also these kind of patterns and the Alberti bass pattern are things that Mozart did an awful lot. And also these kind of scalic passages. Those also come up all the time in various Mozart and other composers' pieces. Yeah, one of the key differences between Mozart and Beethoven is that Mozart was much earlier, and Beethoven was one of the first composers to start pushing into the Romantic period of music, where music was much more expressive. So you would find a lot of contrasting sections in Beethoven's pieces. I mean, literally all of Beethoven's pieces are like that, but one of the most famous examples I can think of is the opening of the Pathetique Sonata, where you get... So already there's a lot of contrast in that piece, because those are massive contrasts in dynamics that you wouldn't necessarily get in a Mozart piece. Beethoven also used a lot of fragmented themes, so he would take one melodic idea and he'd recycle it over and over again, as did a lot of the composers before him. But a good example of this is... which is essentially a 3-note or 4-note theme. And then that piece is recycled over and over again throughout the piece. Yeah, so this left-hand tremolo octave thing, I think, is probably taken from the Pathetique Sonata. Especially with that octave pattern moving down like that, that kind of reminds me of this section of the Pathetique Sonata. There's that, and there's also the descending tremolo here. So it's interesting to hear the influence of specific pieces when people try and write like that particular composer. There's the perfect cadence again with the chord 5 going to chord 1. One of the few things that did stick around through most periods of music, other than the avant-garde stuff. Yeah, I do think Schumann was much more of a harmonic composer. With Beethoven and Mozart, you hear the very specific melodic themes. For example, Mozart's C major sonata. And with Beethoven, for example, Für Elise, you can hear the very clear melodic ideas. Whereas I think Schumann was very much harmony first. So a lot of his pieces are more harmonic in nature, where they're just kind of big spread chords. I'm kind of forgetting that I'm listening to Barbie Girl here. I've said in a few various videos about sort of arranging pop pieces of music or arranging pieces of music in general, but you can actually get away with quite a lot if you keep one thing in the song that's memorable, and usually that's the melody. So if you keep this, then you can get away with a lot in the rest of the music. You can change the chords, you can keep the same chords but change the rhythm, you can change the texture, so if it's thick or thin, and that will all change the quality of sound and the style that you're playing in. It's actually one of the most fun things to do on the piano is mess around with a song in your style or in a style that you like. Yeah, so interestingly, in the more romantic period, which is what Schumann's from and what Beethoven was kind of at the beginning of, they did a lot of theme and variations. And that is where you have one kind of 8/16 bar idea and you play it in lots of different variations, so you play it in lots of different styles, and that's where you do get a lot of the melodies fragmented. And also in regular sonatas, in the development section of a sonata, which is the section B, in a sonata you have an A, B, A structure, and the B section is the development. And usually in the development section of a sonata, it takes the thematic material from section A and it fragments it and develops it and changes it in some way. So actually from the classical period through to the romantic period, you would get a lot of this fragmentation of melodies. If you think about it, you actually get it quite a lot now with pop music using technology. So if you have like a remix of a song, for example, you often get like a fragment of the melody cut out and repeated lots of times. Interesting. So the end of that was a Tiers de Picardy, which is where you play in a minor key, but you finish on the tonic major. So the major chord 1. So for example, if I'm in D minor, if I finished the piece of music, on D major instead, then that would be a tierce de Picardy. It's kind of an interesting thing to use because it adds that extra surprise element at the end. Now, Schubert's an interesting composer to me because he's kind of Schumann-esque, but at the same time, he does focus quite a lot on the melody because he wrote a lot of Lieder, which is like German song. Not to say that Schumann didn't think about the melody, because obviously he has very clear chords and a melody. Schubert kind of gets a very similar result to Schumann in terms of the style that it creates, but I think they wrote in two very different ways to get to that result. I should probably explain what a Neapolitan chord is, because that's come up quite a few times. A Neapolitan chord is also called a Neapolitan sixth chord, and essentially what it is if you have a regular major scale, let's say C major, if you play the flattened second major chord, so for example, note 2 in C major is D. If you flatten that to D flat and play the major chord, and then put it in first inversion, so take this note off the bottom and put it on top, then that is the Neapolitan sixth chord. So it's a major flattened chord 2 in first inversion, which is a very specific thing with a very specific name. And it's actually often used before you get to a cadence. So before you play chord 5 and 1, you might play this Neapolitan sixth chord. And it's just a way of making a piece of music sound more surprising and more interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting because there's quite a few ways that you can go about making it sound like Chopin, depending on what you're trying to do. But Chopin was known as a virtuoso pianist, and he did often compose some more improvised sounding runs into a lot of his music, and you get that all the time in all of his nocturnes. And he also wrote quite a lot in 3/4 time, so in his mazurkas, for example, and in the Waltz in A minor, which is a very popular piece. And then, of course, there's the Chopin etudes, which are very virtuosic and incredibly hard to play. So if you're trying to make it sound like Chopin, you could go down any one of those avenues. I imagine because of the popularity of the Waltz in A minor, he's opted for playing it in that kind of waltzy style, but at the same time he's including the runs that you see a lot in the nocturnes. It's interesting because it's very theoretically sound, as in like he's putting in a lot of features that you would normally see in a lot of this style of music. I don't know whether I would associate these specifically with Chopin now. I associate the quality of sound that he's creating with Chopin, but having a pedal note in the bass, so that is a repeated note while the chords change it over the top. Although Chopin used that a fair bit, a lot of other composers also used that. That was quite a heavily used feature. And the same with the idea of recapitulation. In a sonata, the third section, the A-B-A structure that I mentioned, that third section is called a recapitulation. So that is used also by a lot of composers, where you get the returning of the themes that you originally had. It's definitely giving me Chopin vibes, though. Yeah, so Ravel happens to be one of my favorite composers, and I actually recently went to go and see the Ravel's Piano Concerto in G, and this is actually reminding me quite a lot of the third movement of that. Ravel is interesting because he was a French composer, and in that kind of late 1800s French period of music, you get a lot of these kind of more jazzy qualities to the music. So you can think of composers like Satie with Gymnopédie, Debussy with Clair de Lune, you've got Fauré, you've got Ravel. All of those composers have a much more impressionist style of playing. And another set of piano pieces that are most famous from Ravel are the Miroirs, which I can also kind of hear in this piece because it has kind of a lot of moving parts. I suppose the difficulty with creating that kind of quality of sound when you're playing is trying to include the Barbie Girl melody in there. Yeah, so for anyone who plays a single piece in the style of lots of different composers, they clearly know a lot about the different composers that they're playing. And it's even more impressive for someone whose first instrument isn't even the piano. He's a cellist. So yeah, I think he plays great, and he obviously did a very good job at representing each of the composers. If you want to see my video reacting to Narsol, who played Happy Birthday in the style of 10 different composers, then head on through, and I will see you there.